Hi, everyone. Bit of a schmozzle trying to get on today, so I hope everyone's here. You're probably here before me. So let's hop straight back into it. If you're here, welcome. Let me know you're here. Just drop a comment in the comments so that I can see you. Currently, weather. It's 0 degrees at the moment, which is the warmest that we've had for weeks. And we've just gone through another of those polar vortexes that they were talking about. It got down to 35 below for a while there. So it was very, very chilly. Hi, Audrey. Anyway, so we're enjoying the weather, and they're talking about in about a week's time, the temperature is going to be in the positives, which is really nice. I'm looking forward to that. About this time of year is when you start looking forward to spring cleaning and opening windows and smelling fresh air. So that's another thing that I am looking forward to a great deal. It's been a very long winter here. Also, current events and weather. I don't know if you caught up with email today. Good morning, Karen. Hi. If you caught up with the email today, you would see that I have been busy making things again. Today, I was the guest author on Lois Winston's blog. She writes as Anastasia Pollock. That's one of her characters. And Lois, as I discovered, is a former editor of a craft magazine, which I think would be one of the coolest things to do. But I guested on her blog, and because she's into crafts and she features craft projects and recipes on a regular basis, I gave her one of the projects that I had made, which is, I don't think I've actually shown anyone this one. I made their doggy paw print scarves. They've got their crocheted scarves with dog paw prints in them. And I made 2 of those a couple of years ago for Christmas, but of course I couldn't show any photos online because they were Christmas presents. And I think I forgot to show the photos afterwards too. Anyway, let me just pop this link into comments. If you haven't caught up with the blog post yet, pop over and have a look. You can see one of the scarves that I made stretched out on the blocking table. And you can see the paw prints really clearly, and there is a link to the actual pattern itself too. It's really easy. So let me just put the comment in there. There we go. Let me catch up with who's here. Anna, hello. Hi. Kathy, g'day. Joan, hello. Anna, saw the scarf, ingenious. Thank you. Not my idea. I just follow patterns. So, Ava, I read Lois's blog and noticed your entry. The scarf is adorable. It's very popular with my daughter and my daughter-in-law, except I have such an issue saying daughter-in-law. I haven't got around to accepting that one properly yet. Audrey, thanks for the scarf pattern. I love to crochet. Yes, I do too, much more than knitting, actually. I find knitting gets a bit tedious. You just don't get the results as quickly as you do with crochet. Plus, I love lace, and crochet makes it possible to do some really lacy patterns, which is nice too. And, okay, what else have we here? Let's see, this day in history. So, yes, of course, everyone likes the history bits and pieces. I only have one today. This one's a kind of an interesting one. 1 year ago, 2018, was when the former MI6 spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter were both poisoned with nerve gas in Salisbury in England. That created all sorts of waves in the intelligence community. Diplomats were expelled from countries all over the world, and I think ultimately in the end they decided that Russia was responsible for the poisoning, even though Russia denied it straight out. But I have a semi-personal connection with that story. Well, not personal, but as far as my books are concerned, watching the development of that whole scenario and the denials and the diplomatic crises and so on, was actually part of the inspiration behind Hunting the Cobra, which if you've read, you will understand why, but I can't explain without laying down spoilers. But you can see the connection there, and that was the part of that whole Sergei Skripal poisoning was one of the reasons that I got into that particular storyline. I did a lot of research on nerve gas at the time. That stuff is scary. If it's basically a weapon of mass destruction, and it has been considered such since World War One, which you may have noticed there was a talk about nerve gas in World War One too, when in Time and Remembrance. So yeah, that was only a year ago. It feels like it was much longer because there was such a big fuss about that one, but there we go. And of course, the other thing is Salisbury, England. I know a couple of authors who actually live in Salisbury, and of course it's right on the plain there where Stonehenge is too. So there is that sort of connecting thing that going on. So my attention was drawn to that story a lot because of it. And let's have a look at comments. Anna, my great aunt used to crochet all the time. I used to watch her when I was a child. It was fascinating to watch. Yes, Anna, I remember when I was a kid watching ladies crochet, and they just seemed to move so fast, and most of the time they didn't even seem to be looking very hard about what they were doing, and yet they came out with these intricate patterns that was just fascinating. I used to love watching people crochet. I think that kind of set me up to do crochet later on too. Karen, reading Hunting the Cobra now. So yes, I hope you're enjoying it. You'll probably see what I was talking about when you get further into the book. Industry developments. There's been a few this week, particularly with my books, but also not directly associated with my books. Draft2Digital is a book distributor, what they call an aggregator in the indie publishing industry. They are the people that allow authors like me that are not actually in the United States to distribute to booksellers like iTunes and Barnes & Noble, because, well, it's changed now, but originally Barnes & Noble and iTunes would not let authors just distribute their books if they weren't living in the United States. So we had to use people like Draft2Digital to get our books up onto those bookseller sites. Also, Google was very difficult to get to acquire a publisher account. There are still some authors, most of it's open up to authors now, no matter where they are. But a lot of authors will choose to use somebody like Draft2Digital or Smashwords, because they can just upload to one site, and that aggregator will distribute their books everywhere. But the big thing this week that's happened, and this may have an impact on you as a reader too, which is why I'm mentioning it. Draft2Digital have just started a beta program for print books. So they're going to publish and distribute print books to all the other bookseller sites, which is an interesting development because it used to be that all the indie authors, pretty much everyone, used to create their print books, print editions with a service called CreateSpace, which was actually owned by Amazon, but it was on the surface independent of Amazon. Last year, Amazon closed down CreateSpace and made all the authors come over to Amazon for the Amazon print program. And there are various disadvantages to using that. Probably the biggest one is people like Barnes & Noble get very reluctant to distribute Amazon printed titles through their bookseller site. So the Draft2Digital print program may be a solution to that. So it's possible that in the next few months, as my titles get put up through that print program on Draft2Digital, that my print editions will show up a lot quicker on book sites like Barnes & Noble or on the databases. And that's something else that I wanted to mention too. Because of the distribution program, you can walk into any bookseller brick and mortar, your local, whatever store it is that where you buy print books, if you go browsing in brick and mortar stores. They won't have my books on the shelf, but as long as you have the ISBN number for the print edition, or even just my name and title, they should be able to look it up and find the book on their database and order it in for you. You could do that right now. They should be able to get any of my print books if you want them. So if you find that if you prefer to buy the print editions, you could try that. Just go into your local store and see if they will bring a copy in for you. I mean, if you're going to buy it, it's a guaranteed sale, so there's no reason that they won't bring it in for you. Also news at the moment, of course, War Duke of Britain is out on Thursday. That's the official release date. It is already available on my site because I released it a week earlier on my site. So if you pre-ordered the book from me, you should have your copy now. Enjoy the read. And also in the same series, the very next book in the series, of course, is Hiking of Britain, and I've nearly finished writing it. So it's looking pretty good so far. I'm very happy with it. But once I finish writing it and clean it up a little bit, I put it out for pre-order. So I imagine in over a week, maybe 2 weeks, it should be ready for pre-order. And of course, I'll tell everyone when it's ready to go. So let's have a look. No more comments for right now. I hope people aren't commenting and it's not showing up. I had that tech issue when I started up here, so I'm a bit nervous about comments coming through. So anyway, today could be a long session because I wanted to talk about and talk with you about book lengths, which is a pretty, believe it or not, it's a pretty complex subject. I have to start off with, and I know that you find this kind of interesting, but I have to go into a little bit of tech stuff about the publishing industry so that we can get going on this whole discussion about book lengths. Now, let's start off with, way back when, before the indie industry started up, before electronic books became a thing, which is basically 2007 when Amazon bought out their Kindle reader, the very first one. Before they bought out their Kindle reader and electronic books took off, at that stage, all you could get was print books. They were all distributed through the traditional publishing distribution system. And do you remember, if you remember back then, and I'm presuming that you all do because it really wasn't that long ago, we're talking about 12 years basically, but before then, do you remember that even the genre fiction books were all these big, thick books? They were long, long reads. Do you remember that? I remember that. It seemed to be that all the books were just these massive, great tomes, and they cost $20 to buy. They were just really, really big. There's a reason for that. And let me, to explain that, I'm going to have to go back in a little bit in history. Let's say before the Second World War, let's say before the Second World War, went between the Second World War and way back in history when the first printing press and the first books started production. Up until in that whole time, all you could get were hardcovers. That's the only sort of books that were produced. And because of the expense of printing and the hardcovers, and I mean, these books were beautiful. They were leather bound. They had gold letter on them. The front and back pieces had marbled paper. Do you remember those? Marbled paper is just gorgeous. Some of them had gilt edges, and they were just beautiful. So hardcover books were really the province of the really rich and the influential, and those that had the money to spare to buy the books, and also who had enough income to spare that they had leisure time and could read the books. So it was a very limited market, and it took a long while for that to change. One of the things that changed was just between the First and the Second World War in the 1920s, there was something that started up called the pulp fiction industry. pulp magazines were printed on very, very cheap paper, very thin, and it was called pulp because you could still see sometimes pieces of wood in the paper and stuff like that. That was very cheap, nasty paper. So they were cheap to print these magazines. And they would have, in a 50-page magazine that was printed every single week, they would have 12 stories, including serialized novels and all that sort of stuff. The pulp fiction industry, they had detectives, Raymond Chandler, people like that. They had detective stories and adventure stories and sexy stories, and they had cowboy stories. All the genre fiction stuff that the average reader, those that couldn't afford to buy all the hardcovers, they gobbled up these stories like they were going out of fashion. The pulp industry in its heyday, there were 10 million readers. Every single week they were buying up these magazines and just devouring every single story in them. So the stories were hugely popular. And around about 1935, somewhere in the Second World War, and particularly straight after the Second World War, what happened was they developed a way of printing paperback books that were far, far cheaper than the exclusive hardcover books that everyone had been buying up until then. And also, Penguin in particular, the publisher Penguin in the United States, did something very clever. Instead of distributing those cheap paperbacks via the same bookstores that the hardcovers were, they would sell them everywhere else. Airports, book racks in delicatessens, in gas stations, anywhere you can think of, they'd have a spinning rack of these paperbacks, these cheap paperbacks. And people bought them hand over fist because what they did was they put the same genre fiction stories that were in the pulp magazines into the paperbacks. But of course, with the printing process right then, paperbacks were full novel size. They couldn't do short stories because there just wasn't enough for them to get the cover there. And I'll get into that one in a minute to explain why. So paperbacks exploded, and actually the paperbacks killed off the pulp magazine industry. But most of the authors that were publishing their stories in the pulp magazines just moved over to the paperback industry instead. And so paperbacks took off, and in the 1960s and 70s, there were these massive, massive bestseller books. Jacqueline Suzanne, do you remember her? People, because the publishers were maybe only putting out a dozen or so books in one line per month or per quarter or season, everyone bought the same books, and they were doing print runs that were just out of this world, millions of copies, and selling them all. So the huge mega bestseller sort of came into being around about the 60s and 1970s. There were some people making an awful lot of money in those days. But something else happened after that. I mean, this is the thing with the publishing industry. It keeps evolving over and over again. What happened in the 1970s and 80s is the cost of paper started spiraling out of control. That had a major impact on the books. The little tiny print books that they used to do, the original paperbacks, the novels were the standard novel size, which I will get into in a minute. I'll explain that one too, so just hang in there. But in order to offset the cost of the paper that they were using to print these books, they needed to charge more. And for that reason, they decided that they would make the books longer, because it's cheaper to add more pages to a single book than it is to print more books or shorter books, more copies of shorter books. So they started telling the authors, and this is the thing that the traditional publishing industry does, is it dictates how long a story should be. And the average novel length, particularly in the pulp era, used to be about 40,000 words and up. they now that with the cost of the paper going out through the ceiling, the publishers started saying, okay, we want 80,000, we want 100,000 words, we want 120,000 words. When I first got into writing stories myself, there were a dozen romance markets that wanted books that were 120,000 words long. They are long books. They're really, really long. And in order to make that length, to tell a story at that length, you've got to have a lot of, it's not quite padding if you write it properly, but there's a lot of subplots going on, a lot of stories about the secondary characters, and they're very complicated stories to get them to that length. Or you can just have padding, which is what a lot of some of the authors would do, would just pad the book with unnecessary scenes just in order to get that length so that the publisher was happy. So this is why I was saying just before ebooks came in, all the print books were these really big, massive books, and to a degree they still are, because that print paper cost is still there. So most of the books, fiction books that come from traditional publishers these days, are still long. And that is a characteristic of the traditional publishing industry. Now, what happened in the meantime was the indie industry took off and ebooks took off. And that changes everything too, because you can publish any length you want when it's an ebook. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But first of all, I can see there's a few comments here. So I'm just going to go through comments and then I'll get back to story length. I'll show you something interesting. So Anna, I believe Asimov's stories were first published. Yes, Asimov started off in the pulps. Yes. Ava, pulp fiction is what got my grandmother reading, which she passed on throughout the family. Yes, so we're all readers. Yeah, there were millions of people reading these pulp magazines. They were massive. Heather, Jackie Collins' books were huge. Yes, yes, she was another one of the mega bestsellers in the 60s and 70s. I think it was rather different in Europe. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about, Anna, there. I'm presuming you mean the development of print and paperback and cheap copies and stuff like that. The pulp magazine industry was focused upon America, but there was some spillover to the UK and a little bit into Europe, but not nearly as big. Also, the very cheap yellowbacks, the paperbacks, probably didn't get quite the same distribution in Europe as they did in the United States. And because of the copyright laws, they didn't spill over to England very much either. But as a huge amount of the popular fiction genre is printed and published in the United States, most of the developments of story length were dictated by what happened in the United States. Anna, shouldn't the story dictate how long a book is? Well, there is that argument, and I will get to that one in a minute. But as I'm trying to explain, it's the publishers in the traditional publishing industry who dictate how long the book has to be so that they can manage the cost of the printing, because they know how many pages the story is going to take up. And they have always done that. So if an author wants to be published by a traditional publisher, they have to hit a predetermined word count for their stories to even submit them. That's just the first requirement, is that they hit that length. Audrey, 120,000 words. I guess that explains George R.R. Martin. Tolkien had no excuse. Actually, they tried to cut Tolkien down. They said it was too long, particularly as he had published The Hobbit by that stage, which was a short children's book. And then he presented this, I think it's 800,000 words, Lord of the Rings. I'm not too sure, don't quote me, but I think it's up there somewhere. And they just said, no, we have to cut it down to what, so we can print it in one volume. Luckily, he got his way. There was a 1-volume edition that originally got published, but the 3-volume edition came out later when the book took off and was a huge success. Thank goodness. George R.R. Martin books are actually more than 120,000 words, Audrey. They're usually up around 200,000, 250,000. They're very long. So, but I just want to show you, this is something, I'll show you something. This is how books are made, and this is why print length is predetermined by the publishers. When you're printing a book, it starts off with a long sheet of paper. Imagine this is like, you know, long, hundreds of feet long. And then it gets chopped up into sheets that are called forms. So what happens is those forms are folded. So it gets folded like this. Now, I used to work for a printer, the biggest printer in North America. So I know this backwards. Anyway, it would get folded and then folded again. Okay. And then depending on the form or the printing process, it may get folded another time. Now, those pages, the pages get printed upside down and up that way and down that way, so that when it's folded like this, they're all the right way. And then that form, still uncut and untrimmed, gets matched up with a whole lot of other forms like this. So I've got 4 forms there, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then they get, once they come off the printing press and are folded, they get jammed together and clamped together very, very tightly. And they go through gluing. And so they go through a process where the glue is applied here so that all the pages are held together here. And then they get trimmed. So you've got this nice, tidy, glued pile. Let me just straighten them up like this. And then it gets trimmed. Now, the trimming is a lot more scientific than me with my scissors, but this is basically what happens, is you've got the spine sealed here, and then you cut this. There. And this one here. And actually, the cutting process is more like a grinding process. It shaves off top and side. And then the third side, now I have pages, 1, 2, there. So I've now got a stack of pages in the right order. And then what happens is, this is why you see what they call cover flats. The cover comes along and is wrapped around the sealed spine and then trimmed off. So if I was to trim that, oops, God. Well, this would never pass inspection, of course, but now, there I have my cover, all the pages, and the back cover with a neat spine. And that's how books are printed. And that's why sometimes when you open up a print book at the front or the back, you'll find that there's blank pages there, because the last form, they didn't have enough content to fill up the last few pages of that form, so they just left them blank. They try not to do that very often, but sometimes they have to, because depending on how the form is folded, you have 8 or 16 or 32 pages that you have to fill, and you have to have a set number of pages in the book. So because of the printing costs, the books just got thicker and thicker and thicker. So that's why books are made the way they are, and you get these peculiar, blank pages and things like that in it. And it's also because this is what they call perfect binding and offset printing. It's a very expensive process. Whereas the print books that I do now are printed one at a time, and there is no forms. It's an electronic process. They have an electronic file that just spits out the pages individually. They're all bound up together and glued, and the cover's put on. So they're just printed one at a time. It's called on-demand printing. Individual books are more expensive than books that are printed with the offset printing process. But as you only have to print one at a time, the costs are considerably less. So authors like me can actually do a print edition. And that's another difference that you see between traditional and indie publishing. So because of this process, as you can see, that spine is really, really tiny. The average offset printing and print on demand, there is a limit to how few forms you can have in there. Offset printing is a far higher number. So the average novel, which starts at 40,000, and I'll get into word counts in a minute, the average novel can be printed and bound like that, but a short story that's much, much shorter, there isn't enough paper for the cover to wrap over it properly. So short stories were never printed by themselves in a single volume. You could get anthologies, you could get collections of stories by an author, but not an individual story. Print on demand changed that, because you can get down to almost this thin. The bottom count for print on demand books is about 48 pages. So some authors, including me, will put just an individual short story into a print edition all by itself. And they're the cutest things. I wish I had thought to put one by to show you, but I have shown you before. They're very cute print, skinny little print books with a single short story in them. They're the sweetest little thing. So just a couple of quick comments here. Let me check. Karen, omnibus books could be an option if page quotas is an issue. Yes, and when it comes to traditional printing, they will do things like that too. Mary, hi, hello. Okay, now word counts. I was saying earlier, 40,000 words for a novel is the bottom count. There is like official word counts for stories to classify what they are. And this is based on when, so for instance, a short story is anything up to 7,500 words, 7,500 words. Now that is a standard manuscript page, which is the standard manuscript page has 250 words in it. You don't have to worry about that too much. But if you remember that a short story is up to 7,500 words, you'll get the hang of what that means when you read them. Flash fiction, which is a new category, flash fiction stories didn't really exist until the internet came around, because they were, because of paper restrictions, difficult to print. But flash fiction is, depending on who you listen to, is either anything up to 1,000 words or anything up to 2,000 words. Personally, I think 2,000 is probably the top limit. But so flash fiction, there are flash fiction sites out there that publish a lot of flash fiction every day. Short stories, 7,500 words. And there is one in between that's called a novelette. Now, novelette is 7,500 to 17,499 words. In other words, if you just think 17,500, so 17,500 words, and 7,500 words, that's the novelette. It's a little bit longer than a short story, but it's not a novella. Novellas are 17,500 words up to 40,000 words. So that's the next step down from a novel. Now, novels, particularly writers, a lot of writers are surprised to find out that a novel starts only at 40,000 words. And when novels, particularly in the pulp magazine industry, when novels were first starting to be printed in those little paperbacks or being serialized in the magazines, that's how long they were, was just 40,000 words. A story that's fully developed, with a fully developed character, with a backstory and a properly resolved finale, usually fills about 40,000 to maybe 50,000 words of a novel. And that's what novels always were. It's only when the print industry, when the traditional publishing industry got going because of paper costs and says we want 100,000 words in our novels, that readers got used to the idea that a novel meant that it was long. In fact, a novel just means it's novel. It's an interesting, different story. It's exciting. That's the true meaning of a novel. The actual length is dictated by originally the publisher. Now, all that, and there was one more in the 80s and 90s and stuff like that, when the big novels took off. They had something that they called a plus-size novel or a super novel, and that was anything over 100,000 words. So that is like the final classification in book lengths. But of course, with ebooks and indie published books, we can publish any length we want. And I have actually. I've got books in all the lengths. And as Anna was saying earlier, with indie publishing and ebooks, the story can be the length that it needs to be. We just tell the story, and then we find out that we have like a novella or a novel on our hands or something like that. In fact, I've got very good at plotting stories now, so I can tell just from the outline how long the book's going to be. So I usually have a good idea of what I'm aiming for. And as writers get more experienced, they can make it whatever length they want to. But because it's indie publishing and we don't have a traditional publisher saying you must do 120,000 words, we can publish any length we want. And this is where it gets really interesting. And this is what made me do this topic today. I've been getting the odd review every now and again. And this is a really interesting thing. I get reviews and emails from readers that say, oh, it was way too short. I prefer my books longer. And then I get a lot of reader reviews that say, oh, that was way too long. I prefer just quick reads. So there are readers that sit at either end of the spectrum. Keep that in mind for a second. Because the other thing that I was going to mention is, let me just get down here. There is one factor that affects indie authors and their length, and that is the price. Not because they're greedy and they just want to jack the price up or anything like that. It's actually the opposite. Indie authors are they're trying to find a price where the maximum amount of readers will read their story. So we don't want to price it too high because nobody will buy it. We also don't want to price it too low because a lot of readers have learned that a book that is free or only 99 cents usually isn't worth the read, and they won't buy it either. This is particularly true outside of Amazon, on Kobo and Barnes & Noble and sites like that. Readers they tend to avoid a 99-cent novel because they figure it can't be any good. They're not charging enough for the book. And that's where it becomes an issue. If you have a very, very long book, for instance, the longest book that I've got is 250,000 words. That's the Branded Rose Prophecy. I can't charge very much for that because I can't, let's say I can't charge what I should charge for a 250,000 word novel. It should be up around $9.99, somewhere around about there. If we're doing a strictly length of story dictates price, which it doesn't, but if we were doing that, then it should be around about $9.99 for that novel because it's so long. I actually put it at, I think it's $6.99 US at the moment. And I don't really want to go any lower because it feels I would be giving up a lot of income for such a long story. But the thing is, I don't sell many copies because the price is too high. In order to sell a lot of copies, I would have to bring the price down to $3.99, $4.99. $4.99 is where I usually have my books at the moment. That's right on the outer edge of where readers will stop buying the books, regardless of length. And that's where you will find that a lot of authors, indie authors, are creating books at a length that they think justifies the price. And it's a very subconscious thing. But if they're thinking, well, I can only afford to charge $2.99, they're not going to write a 120,000 word story because they won't be getting their money back. it's like I said, it's very subconscious, but there is that pressure there to write shorter stories because they can't charge as much. And that's probably not a factor that you've thought of as a reader. But if you've noticed a trend with indie authors for shorter and shorter books, that is one of the factors, is that they can't charge very long for them. The other factor with shorter stories is that they can produce more stories more quickly and have them out and published. So that is why you will find that the trend these days is for shorter novels, but longer series. And readers love series. It's just, it is impossible to sell books if they are not part of a series. I've got standalone books that don't sell anything at all because there's no continuing story there. So that shows that readers love long form storytelling. They just really like the long story. So as long as the series has got an overarching storyline, the series will sell well. And there you start to see why the novels are getting shorter and shorter so that they can get them out more quickly, so that readers are getting the books that they want when they want them, but they're telling longer and longer stories. Anyway, I'll stop for a minute. If you've got any questions or comments, let me know. Excuse me. Audrey, Your Time and Remembrance is short and cute. I love that book. Yes, Audrey actually got the print copies. She was the one that won the whole series. So we know that that you actually have that one. Kathy, I suspect that some readers pay no attention to page count for ebooks when shopping for books. You are absolutely correct, Kathy, and I was going to talk about that in a minute too. But this is one of the things that you can actually do for yourself, is check what an author's novel length is before you buy it. Mary, I'm surprised to hear that people don't think 99-cent books aren't any good. I love to buy them, especially if I'm not familiar with the writer. It's a great way to get into a new author. Yes, it is, and so are free books. But even though they're free and even though they're only 99 cents, there is a perception there, particularly for readers outside of Amazon, that the book can't be as good, that the writer, for whatever reason, and it's again, all of this is very subconscious. The pricing is a psychological thing. It's a factor of sales that psychologists have had a ball with for years and years and years. And we learn all this as indie authors. Even if it is subconscious, the reader has got that perception there that if it's only 99 cents, the author must have dashed it off, or it's a throwaway book, or they didn't spend a lot of time on it. There is the perception there that the quality would not be the same as a book that costs $4.99. Whether that is true or not doesn't matter. The perception is there. And if you're shopping yourself, you may find that there is that subconscious resistance to a book that is cheaper because of the perception of poorer quality. So, Audrey, I'm really enjoying your talk. So much involved in publishing. Yes, it is a very complex business. So, Karen, series gets readers hooked, therefore ensures later books are sold. Actually, Karen, you might be surprised. You would think that once somebody got into a series and enjoyed it, that they would buy all the rest. And there are a lot of readers that will do that. In fact, I can see sales on some days where the reader's gone, oh, I love this series. And they've just gone and bought every single book in the series. I love it when I see that in the sales pages. The entire series will click up by 1 or 2, for every book in the series. That's fun days when I see those. But if you actually look at what they call it, follow through or sales follow through on a series, it's a curve that drops down like this. So even if you have 12 books in the series, there are very few people that read the first book who actually get all the way through to the last book in the series. There is quite a drop off. People will give up on a series for all sorts of reasons, including one of the big ones is the author doesn't get the next book in the series out fast enough, which is why I'm particularly keen to hit my 1 book every 4 weeks so that I can hit a series quickly and readers don't lose interest. Mary, psychologists must not live on a budget. I'm quite sure they like to tinker around with the mind and figure these things out. But yeah, pricing is actually, there is huge psychological elements involved in it. There are entire books and industries just on pricing in retail. Very interesting subject. Joan, I have all your Kiss Across Time series and have read them all. Next. Joan, hold your breath. Well, the More Time Kiss Moments is on pre-order right now, so you could go and get that now if you want. And if you buy it directly from me, hint, hint, you get it a week before the release date. So go and check my site. The book is at the very bottom of the front page. You can find it there. So there you are. Next. Now, that was the one thing I was going to get back to on this business of short and long and things like that. I think I've surprised all of you. It's short and long is not just an author decision. An author can decide how long they want the book, but there are a whole slew of other factors involved that dictate how long the book actually ends up being, particularly if they are traditionally published. But even the indie authors are under a lot of different pressures for length of books. So that might be a factor that you want to keep in mind. Excuse me. If you like very long books, or if you like short books, or if you determine that there is a length of book that you in particular like, and it is a thing, I happen to like books that are around about 80,000 words. I like a nice, tight, well-written story that doesn't have a lot of padding in it. So anything up to about 80,000 words is usually a well-told, tight story, and that's the length that I like. You might like books that have got lots of padding and lots of backstory and lots of history, in which case you may be George R.R. Martin length. And one of the things you can do is, whatever your story length is, whatever your favorite stories are, go on to Amazon and look up those books. And you'll find Amazon will give you a standard page length. Now, it's not the same page length as a print book, but the page length is a standardized page length. So every book is measured the same way on Amazon, which allows you to compare the length of stories from one novel to another within Amazon. Goodreads will also give you a page count, but that is not a standardized page count. It is the page count for the print edition. And that number is put in there by the reader that creates the book or the author that creates the book. So one person's 3 pages could be another person's 5 pages. But Goodreads page count is still an approximate count of how long the story is. But Amazon, because it's standardized, is probably a better measure. Once you know what the average page length is for the books that you like, next time you're shopping for stories, try to train yourself to have a look at the page count for that story, for any stories that you're interested in. You'll soon start to very quickly pick up if a book is short or not, or if it's longer than you like. You'll get a sense for, okay, this story, even if the blurb is only 2 lines long, if the page count is up around 900 pages, you know you're going to have a really good read there. So it might be worth getting into. Knowing what that page count is there will give you an idea of the complexity of the story. So if you like lots of history and backstories and subplots, the longer the book, the more possibility there is that the story will have all those elements in it. So in the future, that's something you can do, is learn to look for the page count, which will help guide you on the sort of stories that might appeal to you more. So let's have a look at comment. Joan, thanks. Oh, okay, for more Time Kiss moments? Yes. Let me see what's, oh my goodness, I've talked my mouth off. It's 5 to 3. So let's wrap up very quickly here. If you've got any more comments before we end for the day, throw them in there. Has this been useful? I hope you found this interesting. I know someone did say that they enjoyed it, Audrey. But if there is other topics like this that have always puzzled you about the publishing industry and you'd like the warts and all explanation, let me know. Send me an email or put it in comments. I'm happy to talk my head off about this stuff because I happen to know it quite well. As I mentioned, I used to work for a printer, so I know all the the printing bits and pieces. I've also worked for a magazine, so I know how they work. But yes, if you'd like an expose on any part of the publishing industry, I'm always happy to talk about that. Just let me know. Mary, I'm going to have to start paying attention to Amazon's page counts, although I read just about any length story. Yeah, Mary, even if you're quite happy to read any length, knowing what the length is going into it quite often sets you up so you're not disappointed because it suddenly ends or something like that. It's basically the equivalent of picking up any paperback book and being able to judge by how big it is. I mean, paperback books, you do it automatically because it's really thick or it's really skinny. So you know going in approximately how long the story is. You can do the same thing by checking the page count on Amazon. It'll instantly give you a good idea of how big the story would be if you were holding a print edition in your hands. That's what that does for you, is give you the same feedback as the print books do when you look at them. Okay, Audrey, thank you. You're welcome. Joan, thank you. No problems. Mary, thanks so much for today's talk. I love learning about this kind of thing. Glad to hear it. I don't want to bore anyone. So, okay, so I think that's it for today. Thank you very much for coming. Glad to have your company. And I'll see if I can think of something super interesting for next week. See you then.